Hello, my name is Otoma Edje. Welcome to season 2, episode 38 of Image Bearers. I'm so excited to have on the program today Gordon Ferguson and Michael Burns, who's also assisting with the interview. So welcome again to the program. So today we're actually going to
I'm glad to be here.
You too.
Enjoying the weather in Minnesota there?
No, I am decidedly not enjoying the weather in Minnesota. It's blizzarding right now. I'm going to venture a guess that the weather is a little nicer where Gordon's at right now.
Yeah, I went on a long prayer walk this morning, and I did wear a long sleeve shirt. And the wind I thought was bad today. It was maybe 18 miles an hour.
What's the temperature?
I shed a little tear for you, Gordon.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. So your temp and your wind factor is what in Minnesota?
It's a weird day. The temperature was 40 this morning. It's supposed to be below zero by tonight. I don't know what it is exactly right now, but we're supposed to get 8-9 inches of snow, and the wind is gusting around 45-50 miles an hour. So real joy, real good day for a prayer walk.
Yeah, if I were there, I would not have one. I'd pray inside.
So again, welcome everyone to the program. Today we're going to be discussing Gordon Ferguson's new book. I think you have a copy with you, don't you, Mr. Gordon?
I do.
Yep. So it's just come out. The title is God, Are We Good? And the subtitle is also a question, Can I Know For Sure? And so for those that may not be aware, Gordon Ferguson is a graduate of Northwestern State University and the Harding School of Theology. With more than 50 years of experience, he has served as an evangelist and elder and teacher. He emphasizes leadership, training, and teaching. Gordon has also written 17 books, of which I've read a few of those, which is Discipling, The Power of Discipling, The Victory of Surrender, Prepared to Answer, and I'm sure I'll be reading more as time goes. 17 books and audio video teaching series. Gordon and his wife, Teresa, live in McKinney, Texas, and attend the Dallas-Fort Worth Church of Christ. For more articles and information and speaking schedule, you can go to Gordon's website, and I'll link that in the show notes. And for those that may not know about Michael Burns, he's a guy I bug a lot, but he has a lot of patience, so amen. He is a teacher in the Minneapolis St. Paul Church of Christ. He is a graduate of Wesley Seminary of Indiana Wesleyan University. That's a mouthful. He taught high school history in the central city of Milwaukee for nearly 10 years. He is a national, international biblical teacher at churches and workshops. He is the founder and director of the Ministry Development and Training Academies centered in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and he serves as an instructor in the Ministry Training Academies in Africa. He is also the author of the Core series, C-O-R-E, series of books, and he's married to Micretia, and he has 2 sons and lives in Roseville, Minnesota. And he's a good friend. I think, like I said, I do bug him a lot for questions, but he has got the patience of Job, who continually puts up with my shenanigans. So I appreciate that. But again, welcome.
Otoma, if I can ask you a question there, you do text me a lot at like 4 a.m., which I'm up, but do you ever sleep? That's my question.
No, I'm an old man, so at least I tell myself I go to bed really early so I can wake up early.
Okay.
So that's the dealio. Yeah. And do you sleep? I know you're always answering my texts and doing all kinds of stuff.
Well, some. Yeah, I sleep some.
Okay. So I know, Gordon, you've written 17 books, as we said, kind of in the intro. And you've written various books, some pretty deep theologically, such as, Prepared to Answer. You've written others, such as Discipling, which was definitely a very important book for our family of churches, many years ago, and continues to be. And you've written, obviously, written a marriage book. So you've written a number of books. So now you've written this new book. And my question is, what kind of inspired this and why now?
Well, the answer to that is I, of course, talk with a lot of people about God, about the Bible, about their lives, etc. And I found there are a lot of people, particularly in the Bible Belt where I live, that would pass themselves off as Christians, but they know virtually nothing about the Bible. And so it's very difficult sometimes to get them to sit down and talk with you. And I certainly try that from many different angles all of the time. But I think people are a little embarrassed about the fact that they are supposedly Christians, at least in their minds, and yet they don't know any Bible. And so the idea of actually talking Bible is a little scary to them. And so I thought, well, if I would write a short book and deal with some of the main things that people come up with, maybe they could read that and then we could talk further and go from there. So that's my idea. I have a lot of these books on hand right now. I just received them, but I will be getting them to friends and neighbors and relatives because I want to promote them actually thinking about their relationship with God. And yet, most people I talk with, even though they don't know the Bible, they still very quickly say they're okay with God. And as I pursue that further with them, it seems that the answers fall into three basic categories. I'm a good person. And of course, that's a widespread theology. I'm a good person. And so God's got to be pleased with me because I'm not, I'm not Hitler. And then the other answer is, well, I got saved at some point, or I'm saved. And they have some experience. It may be a dream. It may be some religious activity they had at one time. It may be a prayer that got answered. I've had all of those submitted as evidence that they're right with God. But that's a fairly common thing that I run into also. And then, of course, the other is I'm a committed Christian. And that's an answer. And in their minds, they really are. And their lives would give some fairly good evidence of that. But my question is, does their salvation experience line up with the Bible? And so that becomes a little more of a doctrinal thing, but it's broader even than that. And I cover that in one of the chapters. In fact, Michael spurred me on to write a chapter that I have that kind of introduces the thinking about the concept of I'm already a committed Christian. So I broaden it out and show it's not just about salvation. It's about what God has planned for us to do on earth. And it's not a solo adventure at all. It's a kingdom adventure. It's an adventure of all races in one body. It's, a number of things that would tie us together. So anyway, though, that's sort of what got me going, but I wanted to have something short, to the point, non-confrontational, on a personal level for sure, but I want to have something I could just give to a lot of people and hopefully spur further talks and discussions and studies.
Thank you. So I think you answered a little bit of my next question. Obviously, the book is short; it's less than 100 pages. I read it today. It's a pretty easy read in that sense, but it's a very important read. One of the things you have in the way that you present the book, it's in a very conversational style. You kind of alluded to that a little bit already. And why do you feel like that was important with this book? Because I know you could have just come down and said, like, theologically, this is the deal and this kind of a thing, but it's more of a conversation. And I think you also mentioned in the book, you went on a trip, a fishing trip with a pastor, and there was, some different things that occurred there and how he interacted with you.
Well, I do go back in my own history a bit to try to help people get comfortable and not fearful as we're talking about spiritual things. But my own experience was I didn't want anything to do with church. I didn't want anything to do with anything on a spiritual level. And yet my wife would drag me to church every now and then because she definitely was interested in pursuing God. And so this minister I met at this church we attended asked me to take him fishing, which was the last thing I wanted to do, is get stuck in a boat with a preacher. I mean, that was a horrible thought. And I finally agreed. It was embarrassing to say no, since I had a nice boat and I knew where to fish and how to fish. It was embarrassing to say no, so I said yes. And then after I did, he said, well, why don't we go on a Friday night and we can fish all night and fish all the next day. And I had a tent that we could camp out in. And so the nightmare worsened at that point. The idea of spending the night and then the next day with a preacher, that was a tough one for me to get around. But we did it, and it was a blast. The guy was a very interesting fellow. He was not a, quote, religious type of guy. He was just a down-to-earth, fun guy that knew how to fish. I mean, the guy really knew how to fish, and we caught a ton of fish and just had a wonderful time. And so he was always conversational. He never preached to me. I mean, he knew at the time that I was smoking and drinking and probably some other things, but he still was just fun. He just would share his own life and share Bible things and did it in such an exciting way. And so what I wanted to do in the book, and this is somewhat different than my long book, Prepared to Answer, which goes into many different church doctrines and deals with it in some depth. But I wanted to have something that would be conversational and non-confronting. And so I tried to make it clear a number of times in the book with disclaimers that, it's not about me being right and you being wrong or vice versa. It's really about God having the answers in his word. And let's just think through this together. And so let's reason together, let's not argue together. Let's reason together and take a look at what God says, because we're all sinners, and let's just listen to him. And that was the atmosphere I wanted to create as somebody read the book.
Thank you. And I think even just listening to you on the podcast today, that's what comes across too. So thank you.
So Gordon, I'm curious, was there anything challenging about writing this book for you? What was the most challenging aspect of writing this book?
Trying to write it in the tone I just described, because by nature, I am more of a confrontational type of guy, personality wise. I'm not one of these that's backs off too easily. And I can come on in a very strong way. I have I'm old. That's threatening to some people. I'm rather loud. I think my voice has softened some with age, but it naturally had pretty much of an edge to it as a young guy. I didn't always need a microphone to preach. So I wanted to be able to just share it in a way that people could be comfortable as they read it, and whatever discomfort they felt would be from the Bible itself and not from anything that I said or the way that I said it.
So quick question. This is out of left field again here. So I'm curious to see your first responses. What was the most difficult book for you to write of all your books?
Wow, I'd have to think. I've written a number of them. Some were easy, like my little marriage book, Fairy Tales Do Come True. We're about to celebrate 56 years of marriage, and we're still madly in love and all of that. So we've got quite a story there. That was a fun one to write. I think maybe the early book on discipling, I think that was back in 1997, if I recall. And we just entitled it Discipling. Later, it was condensed down to a much shorter version called The Power of Discipling. It's basically the same content, but it's shorter. And when I wrote that book in 97, I didn't actually figure this out for a while, but I felt a lot of pressure from that one. I felt like I've got to cover all the different angles. I can't just give some nice little chapters here about a good idea. I need to be fairly comprehensive in the way that I cover it and not leave any loose ends out. And the thing that I think became the heaviest part of it, and I didn't realize this maybe until near the end of the book or even after I finished it, but the heaviest part was I realized that I was making a statement for our movement of churches at that time, which at that time were quite controversial. And so I realized that I was making a statement for our churches. So I think it was heavy for that reason.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I can confirm that when you're writing on a topic and you're like, man, it's so big that I've got to cover and make sure I don't miss things. Like, you feel a lot of pressure as you write it,
Yeah.
and it weighs on you. So
Yeah. Well,
I get it.
Of all people, you understand because your books are all like that.
Right. Right. Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah. And you helped me through that process as well. So I've learned a lot about processing through that from you. But let me ask you a specific question about this new book. You talk about the fact that Jesus didn't come just so that we could go to heaven, but he wanted to establish a kingdom. Why is that an important theological concept for us to grasp?
Well, I think it is all related to the fact that, yes, God does want us to go to heaven. He wants everyone to go to heaven, but how does he propose to get us there? And I don't think it's just for us to one-on-one share with the world. I think the world has to be drawn to Christ through seeing him. One of the things in the chapter that I added because of your input talks about the kingdom, that we are a kingdom. We're not individual solo experiments here in our relationship with God. We're intended to be a kingdom that would demonstrate his will on earth as it is in heaven, a part of that model prayer. Then there's a section in there on the fullness of Christ. And so one of the intriguing things to me for a long time has been this concept that Jesus is said to be the fullness of God in the flesh. And so he demonstrated God in the flesh. And the church is called the fullness of Christ. And so if people really couldn't grasp God until they saw him as a man in the flesh, Jesus is saying to us that people aren't really going to grasp me until they see me in human beings. And the church itself gives that picture. I don't give it all myself, but combined with a lot of other people, we are to give that picture. And then I also added in there a church of all nations, because I think there's no greater testimony. All of us teach and write about the subject of racial issues. There's no greater demonstration of Christ to me than to have a diversity of church membership. Not simply diversity racially, ethnically, etc. on Sundays, but that we relate that way generally, that race is not something that really we think that much about in the church, if we have the right kind of relationships. Because I don't know, I talk to people about DNA tests all the time, and people find out I'm a lot more of this than I thought. And we're all kind of mixed up, at least in this country. Large percentage of the population's mixed race anyway, whether we know it or not. And so when you have a fellowship that gets right, then being a church of all nations is a delightful thing, as our different backgrounds, ethnicities, etc., bring so much more to the table to enjoy together.
That makes a lot of sense. Appreciate that. But let me ask you another. Let's dig down into a couple of terms you use in the book. You talk about the relationship between grace and faith, and there's a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of teaching about grace and faith. Can you explain how they're related to our salvation? What does God do? What do we do? How do you approach that in this book?
Okay, well, let me answer from a Bible Belt perspective. This is an evangelical community in which I live. Of course, we've got all kinds and different nations and different kinds of churches and religious organizations, et cetera, in our community. But in general, Texas is an evangelical state. And so when you think about how they view grace and faith, it's very simple, too simple, but it's very simple. God's grace is Jesus died for our sins. Faith is we pray the sinner's prayer, or we confess Christ as Lord, or we, uh, do something quickly there to accept that grace. And now we're saved. And once we're saved, we're always saved. And that's a very common doctrine. That's why more people aren't in church on Sunday, because they got saved. They can be saved no matter what else happens in their mind because of their view of once saved, always saved, or the eternal security of the believer. And so that's how this is viewed. And so when you tell a person like that, well, no, there are conditions of you accepting God's grace. It's not just a sinner's prayer here. We're talking about a serious life commitment. We're talking about an act of obedience that is the entrance into a relationship with Christ. And so they very quickly will say, well, you're saying you have to work and earn your salvation, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, there's no way anybody can earn anything. We're all sinners and deserving of hell, and God intervened. But the way I would look at it is grace is the meriting factor. And of course, that's the cross of Jesus. And that was in the mind of God from the time Adam was created. That was a given. That was from the creation of the world, that was going to be a part of the whole plan to reach mankind. But at any rate, that's God's grace in the cross. And so people before the cross as well as after the cross, that's the ground or the basis or the meriting factor of their salvation. And so grace, simply meaning unmerited favor, is totally housed in the cross of Christ. Now, my faith is not simply mental assent. Okay, I believe in Jesus. I believe in the resurrection. I believe in the death on the cross. It's not simply mental assent. It's not simply trust either. The word faith I find it, is used in at least 6 different ways, slightly different ways in the New Testament. And certainly mental assent and trust are 2 of those, but it is broader than that. And so faith to me is certainly the means by which we accept God's grace, Christ's death for us. It is the means. It has to do with conditions. It doesn't have to do with merit at all. And so I often, in teaching about grace and faith, will talk about someone gives you a $500,000 and gives you a bank withdrawal slip and tells you to meet a certain officer at the bank at a certain time the next day, and you get $500,000. The fact that you go down there, and you'll be early, I'm sure, but you go down there and you see Mr. Smith or whoever it is, and you meet the conditions. You don't walk out of the bank thinking you've earned $500,000. You walk out of the bank thinking that the giver of those gifts is a wonderful, wonderful person to bless you with something and give you such a gift. It's still a gift, even though it had some conditions attached to it. So I think we have to help people with an evangelical background, particularly, to see that faith is accepting God's grace, but you have to understand exactly what are the conditions of that acceptance, and there are conditions. It doesn't change it being a gift status.
That's great. So real quick then, another curiosity question. Who's this book for? Who'd you write this for? Who should go buy this book?
Well, I mentioned it to our region leader in the DFW church where I attend. I mentioned the book to him, and his immediate reaction was, wow, I think every one of our members needs to go back through and see these basics very clearly, because I think we have a lot of people kind of fuzzy on the basics. And so that was a little surprise to me, because what I had in mind was to give it to people that were in name religious, or at least in name thinking they're okay with God, but to try to prompt them to learn some Bible and to actually discover what it is that God is asking of us to have a right relationship or a saved relationship with Him. So I was thinking more for the non-Christian, or the person that even is following Jesus to the best of their understanding, but needs some help in some areas, sort of like Apollos did with Aquila and Priscilla back in Acts 18. So I was thinking more of that sort of person. But then after Derek said what he did, I thought, yes, this would be a helpful book to our church members, to help them in helping others.
So in other words, one of two categories: if you're a Christian or you're not a Christian, you should buy this book.
Exactly.
So you've covered that ground pretty well there, Gordon. So if you fall into one of those two categories, Christian or non-Christian, buy this book. There you go.
Very good.
I got one more question for you.
Okay.
You talk about in the book, if we want to understand conversion, that we should really study the book of Acts carefully. And you talk a bit about the conversion of the jailer in Acts 16. And how his and his family's conversion demonstrates both the broader sense of faith and the more narrow sense of faith. So can you explain a little bit how that plays into understanding conversion?
Okay. Great question. Very important question in this last part of the book to those that consider themselves committed Christians. The book of Acts is the book that shows conversions. It doesn't just talk about different aspects that are involved in an active faith, but it gives you examples. And so to me, Acts is very pivotal in understanding conversion, because most people don't know that much about the Bible. They've never learned to study the Bible contextually. And so they have a favorite verse, John 3:16 or some other, and they go to that, and then they make a lot of assumptions. It's incredible, actually, how many assumptions all of us can make about what a given verse actually teaches if we don't learn to study contextually. And I will say that you are one of the best teachers of context that I have ever seen. And so, as I've often said, Michael, you have become probably my favorite teacher among a lot of really favorite teachers I have, but I love your context study. And a lot of that comes from your knowledge of history and your love for history, but you're always putting us back in that setting. In order to understand a given verse, I have to know not only the surrounding verses or what the book itself is about, the particular letter in the Bible, but I have to know history. I have to know, okay, well, what was actually going on 2,000 years ago in Rome, if I'm going to understand some of what Paul is writing. So at any rate, Acts then becomes very important because it goes through a series of different conversions. And Acts 16 is very pivotal because it gives you a long account, and it gives you an account of a total pagan guy. He's not a Jew. He doesn't have a certain background. And sometimes when you talk about the conversion process, people will say, well, in Acts 2, a certain thing happened because those were Jewish people. But with Gentiles, it's different, and we're Gentiles, so therefore the conversion process is different. Acts 16 says, not so. It's the same thing in Acts 16 as you're going to find in Acts chapter 2. But the word faith itself, one of the terms is, of course, to believe, the mental assent type of thing. Trust is certainly involved. We've got to trust in Jesus, trust in God's grace, trust in the cross as being sufficient to take away our sins. But it also involves an action if God asks for an action. And so in Acts 16, you've got Paul and Silas in jail, and the earthquake occurs, and the jailer is about to kill himself, but then Paul says, don't do that. We're all here. It's got a whole lot of background to it, by the way. But anyway, the jailer immediately says, what must I do to be saved? Now, I'm not sure if he meant saved spiritually or physically. I think probably spiritually, because he would have known a lot about what had happened to produce Paul being in jail. You'd have to know something of what Paul was preaching and teaching, it would seem to me. But at any rate, he says, what must I do to be saved? And Paul's initial response is, believe in the Lord Jesus and you will be saved and your family as well. Now, of course, a lot of people stop right there and say, well, yeah, see, there you go. Just you need to do the sinner's prayer or the something similar and just pray that God forgives you your sins and believe in Jesus and you're okay. But he did say, believe in the Lord and you'll be saved and your household. So obviously Paul's ready to broaden the audience and do some teaching. You can't believe without knowing what to believe. And so he goes on and preaches Jesus to him. And the result was they go out after midnight. That's when all this started occurring. They go out after midnight, and Paul baptizes the jailer and baptizes his family and puts himself at risk in doing that. If Paul had run then, the jailer still would have lost his life. And so the question comes up, why would they go out after midnight to do that? Well, as you look at passages like Acts 2 or Acts 22 or whatever, you find out that baptism is our burial with Christ. That is our identification with his death. That's how God views that. And that's where our sins then are forgiven, because we participate in his death. We enter into his death spiritually, and we're raised to walk in a new life, as Romans 6 says. So it puts the whole package together, but the beauty is in the last verse of that account. It said, after all that occurred, the gospel got preached. They believed it. They went out after midnight. They were baptized into Christ. And then it's summarized with a broader view of faith that includes the whole interaction. It says that he set food before them and they rejoiced greatly, having come to believe in Christ. And so having come to believe was the whole process. It wasn't just mental assent or trust. It included also an act of obedience, in this case, being baptized into the death of Christ, as Paul would put it in Romans 6.
That's great. I appreciate your answers. I'm going to turn it back over to Otoma, but I reserve the right to hop in and ask another question.
You always have good questions.
Sure. That's awesome. So just continuing on the line of faith, I think that's such an important topic, obviously. I know in Hebrews 11:6, I know there are many elements of faith, but there are definitely three mentioned in Hebrews 11:6. Can you cover that a little bit, as the just the faith aspects in Hebrews 11:6?
Yeah, Hebrews 11 is a great chapter about faith. Of course, it's the roll call of the faithful in the Old Testament, where the writer of Hebrews goes back and talks about everyone in the lineage coming up to the New Testament days. It's a beautiful chapter about people who lived by faith, and certainly it shows that it was a life commitment to God to be a person of faith. But he says in chapter 11, verse 6, without faith, it's impossible to please God. Well, okay, that's pretty serious business there. So you can't be right with God without faith. But then he defines it. He breaks it down at least into three categories, three of those uses that I mentioned out of the six. And he says, whoever comes to God must believe that he is. And so that's mental assent. And then and that he is a rewarder. And so there comes the trust aspect, that if we do what God said, then he is going to give us reward. And then he goes on to say that he rewards those who diligently seek him. Whatever version I'm quoting there, I forgot, but that's the idea. And so the seeking him has to do with obedience. And so we have belief, trust, and obedience. And so what do we believe? What do we trust? And what do we obey? And so it just happens that the Bible is expressed in facts, in promises, and in commands. And so you trust the facts. I mean, you believe the facts, you trust the promises, and you obey the commands. And so in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's a fact that the Bible starts with, the Old Testament. Now, I can't obey that, right? There's nothing to obey. It's not a command. It's just simply a statement of fact, and I believe it. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I believe it, and that pleases God because it's a fact. I can't do anything else with it. If he gives me a promise, then he wants me to trust that. And there are many, many beautiful promises in the Bible, and God just wants me to trust that. And so one of my probably most popular books is called The Victory of Surrender. And that one is all about the trust aspect of faith, surrendering to God, trusting him, believing that he's going to keep his promises. But then if he gives a command, I can't just simply say, wow, well, that's nice, isn't it? If he gives a command, the only way to have faith is to obey whatever that command is. And so the idea of those three aspects of faith corresponding to facts, promises, and commands, that to me encapsulates salvation by faith and a salvation that pleases God. Beautiful little verse, but it is pregnant with meaning.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, I think as I was reading the book, and I think you did a very good job of anticipating some of the issues that people would have as they're reading it. And one of the things you mentioned is some of the tensions that people would face. And you kind of address that. You also share some of the tensions that you faced and continue to face, just kind of wrestling with all these things. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, those last two chapters in there, plus the last little bit, I wrote something that I've never put in a book before. I called it a postscript. And I said, this is not an epilogue. It's not the normal conclusion. It's kind of an afterthought. And so the postscript is interesting as well, but it ties into those two chapters about tensions in the air. And so in the first of those chapters, Tensions in the Air, part 1, I talk about people that I know personally that are very dedicated to God. They have some things I think that are off base doctrinally, but as far as their heart commitment to God and even a life that reflects that heart commitment to God, they have a lot going for them. And so it's difficult for me to say, well, here's a person, and because they haven't done what I think the Bible teaches about receiving initial salvation, because they haven't done that, then therefore they're doomed to hell. It's hard for me, produces tension in me to look at a person like that who has that level of commitment in both heart and life. It's hard for me to look at that person and say, well, no way they can be saved. And so I describe some of the tensions that I've heard from other church leaders in my own family of churches who basically teach the same thing I do about what it takes to become a Christian. And yet they feel those tensions. They've expressed it different ways, but they feel the tensions. And so I thought, well, let's just get it out on the table here and be honest about it. Some will, in my own family of churches, will be uncomfortable with that. And that's why I wrote the postscript, actually. Some might be uncomfortable with that I don't just take a hard line stand and say, no way, unless you've done it exactly as I believe it ought to be done biblically. Tensions in the Air, part 2, is I put myself on the other side and say, okay, I'm one of these committed Christian types that's really trying to live the life and have given myself in my heart to Jesus. I'm really trying to live the life. And no, I haven't done what you say the book of Acts teaches about initial salvation. I haven't done that in the way you describe it or believe the Bible describes it. But anyway, I still feel okay with God. Well, I put myself on that side and say, okay, here is why I actually could not live with that. Here's the tension I would feel if I was where you are, and I would like for you to really give some thought to that.
Thank you. No, I'm glad you put that in there, because I think to just, it's almost like a cold-hearted book if it just comes across as this is what needs to happen without trying to understand and empathize and put yourself in the shoes of people as they're going through and reading it. So I appreciate that. One thing you also mentioned, just as you're closing out the book, you mentioned, obviously, as a person takes a stand for salvation, there are really two things that kind of can come back at a person as statements. You know, you're being narrow-minded and being judgmental. And I think you use Matthew 7 to kind of, I guess, address that. Can you cover that a little bit?
Yeah, the religious world has moved for many, many, many decades in a direction of being very non-definite about doctrinal teaching. And so, you know, that's been pretty much my whole life, and I'm an old man. And so that's been the case for a very long time. You can't judge somebody else, and you can't say somebody else is wrong, or you can't say this or that. And so truth has become very relative. And we have different terms for that. Postmodernism is maybe the more modern one that we use right now, but relativism, and there are a number of other terms that I used when I was younger, but it was all sort of the same thing, and that is that truth is not absolute. Now, what people mean by that is truth in the area of morals and religion. There's no definition there, but they believe that truth is absolute in other areas. They believe that this vaccine for COVID-19 better be right, or it could mess me up. And so when it comes down to developing medicines or what the pharmacist gives you when you go in for medication, you want that one right, because you know if he gives you the wrong medicine, or she, you could get killed. And so when it comes down to many things, we are absolute in saying there is truth, and we want it followed exactly. Whoever designs those planes for Boeing and all these other companies, Airbus especially, whoever designs those, I want it exact. I believe there is a truth about how that ought to be engineered, designed, and produced and put together and all of that. You see, we want truth and insist on it in a number of areas. But when it comes down to morals and religion, that's where we get so relative and say, well, whatever you believe is truth for you. And so when you take a stand, people are so quick, especially in today's politically correct and often spiritually incorrect world, people are so quick to say, well, you're just judgmental, you're narrow-minded. And Matthew 7 talks about a narrow road and a broad road and says most people are on the wrong road. I mean, that's what Jesus said. I'm sure with a heavy heart. That's what he said. So my statement is, I don't want to be any more, I want to be as narrow as the Bible is, no wider than that. And as far as being judgmental, I'm not the judge. God is the judge, and he wrote a book. And we need to read the book and let him be the judge about what is good and what is not good, what is true and what is not true. And so that's the whole thing. Sometimes I use the illustration of what people have done in the last century. And basically, you've had theologian number one come along, and he says, well, yes, the Bible says this, but I think God will also accept this. And so he makes the road a little broader. Theologian number 2 comes along and says, oh, yes, I agree with theologian number 1. In fact, I think God will accept this, and he makes it even broader. And so my question is, who's being judgmental here? Am I being judgmental by trying to stick to the Bible? Or is the theologian in the theological world who keeps broadening this, are they not the ones that are making a judgment that God will accept what God did not say he would accept? Now, to me, that's a scary kind of judgment, is to broaden something that God has not broadened. If he wants to do that on the judgment day, amen. He's the judge. But I can't tell you that theologian A or B there is correct in the illustration. I can tell you the Bible's correct.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of times that's perceived as being more gracious, when in reality it's actually a whole lot worse. Because again, we're making, to your point, a stance on things that God has not made a stance on.
Exactly.
We better be 100% sure, and we're not going to know that in our lifetime, anyway. So.
Yeah, if I were the judge, I would be being gracious, but I'm not the judge. So therefore, I'm being judgmental when I change what God has actually said.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Before we have you, I wanted to see if you can read a section of your book, but is there anything you wanted to share, Mike, or any questions you had?
I think I'm good.
Okay. So I think as we wrap it up, I know there's a section, I think on page 92, which I think just speaks to your heart in this book, Gordon. Could you maybe just read that section as we wrap it up here?
Okay, one paragraph here. I just wanted to end up with a tone that I've been trying to create all the way through, but I certainly wanted to leave this as the last thing because that's what people take away with them. And so it says, with that, I close. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for reading this book. It is a labor of love for me, love for God, love for the Bible, and love for my fellow human beings. I care. We are on this journey together, and it will end up before the judge of all. May we arrive at the same destination fully prepared by the grace of God. Pray for me, and I'll pray for the readers of this book every day once it's published. And then I quote a scripture, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. Numbers 6, 24 to 26. God bless and peace out.
No, I definitely appreciate that. And I'm glad you read that because I think it does just share your heart, which, you can be 100% right, but if people don't know how much you care, as we know the saying goes, and I think you definitely show that and demonstrate that with your book. Actually, before we started, I actually made some notes on who the audience of the book is, kind of like similar to Michael's question. And I do think it is a book for family and friends, also for disciples. I don't think it's just for perhaps the person studying the Bible who didn't understand something. I think it's really for everybody. So as Michael said, you definitely have your bases covered there. I did want to, just as we close it out here, just to have a little bit of a conversation in reference to, it's been a tough year, but I think at the same time, a year of growth in some respects. I know that for me, I've had some different health challenges. Work definitely has its challenges too. There's been a lot of racial tension, obviously, but I think it's also an opportunity. Things have crumbled, but I think it's also good because it's allowed, I think, society kind of start rebuilding the right way. I'm definitely looking forward to 2021. I think just because it's been such a challenging year, but at the same time, a good year. I'm looking forward to trying to make some more progress on my little book that I'm writing, Image Bearers, which is also what this show is called after. And just, hopefully getting that vaccine soon and trying to start hugging people, something I'll have to remember how to do. But what about you guys? How has the year been for you, and what are you looking forward to in 2021? We'll start with you, Mr. Michael.
Well, yeah, this year's been an interesting year. Certainly not the way I would have foreseen it going at the beginning of the year. It's funny when the pandemic first hit, I kind of had the thought of like, man, everybody's focused on this. I'm kind of chill for a couple months and take some time off and just work on some projects. And then, of course, this year to the forefront came issues of race and culture and politics. And having written books on all three of those topics, it kept me fairly busy this year. And then, my wife as well, being a critical care nurse, working with COVID patients, it's a busy year for her. So I think we're looking to next year to find a way to get a little bit of time off together, a little bit to rejuvenate with God. But I really want to focus for myself in 2021. Yeah, I've gone on a string of writing 4 books in the last 3 years, and that's not a huge amount, but it keeps you busy. And I really want to focus on learning in 2021. Maybe God will call me to some projects, and I'll continue in the ministry and local ministry and teaching classes and doing some of that. But I really want to focus on I've been doing a lot of it, and so I really want to focus on some elements of that.
Good deal. Thank you. Mr. Gordon, what's your thoughts? How has the year been for you, and what are your plans for 2021?
Well, this year, like most of my years, has been kind of a roller coaster. I'm an emotionally based guy, so I'm up and down and all around fairly consistently. This year has been a challenge for me. I have at times been great with the isolation part. At other times, I've been lonely. I have 3 grandsons. My son and his wife and 3 grandsons live within a mile of us. And so we have tried to see them and, do it socially distanced. So I haven't hugged they're basically grown. The youngest is a junior in high school. But I haven't, even hugged my grandsons for a long time here. And I miss the hugs. I miss the closeness and all of that for sure. And so, I've had some days have been great, and other days when I just feel like, wow, I'm sick of this. I'm sick of this COVID-19 isolation stuff. And we have to be careful. I mean, we're in the age group that puts us at high risk. My wife has COPD, which is somewhat mild. She's not on oxygen or anything like that, and gets around and exercises and does different things, but she's had pneumonia 6 times. And so her getting COVID, that's something that we've worked real hard to avoid. And so having to be as careful as we have, I'm very tired of that isolation. The other part with me that's a very interesting thing is this stage of life. I just turned 78 in October, and my wife's 77. And so for the last several years, I've been sort of wrestling with, well, God, what should I be doing? In one sense, I feel very strongly that I need to move aside in a lot of areas and make way for younger guys. I mean, I felt that for a long time and have done some of that, turned things over to other people and that were a lot younger, et cetera. But at the other hand, I've still, or on the other hand, I've got gifts that God's given me, and what should I be doing? And so one prayer I came upon, or idea for it, a good while back was, God, would you just be my scheduler? I need a divine scheduler here. And if you want me to do something and it comes my way, I'm going to say yes, but I'm not going to go out looking for it. And so I've sort of followed that, and I've had more come up this year that I didn't expect. I did a teaching weekend in Singapore recently. They asked me to fly over and do some teaching, and I said, I'm not doing those long trips and being away from my wife, and she can't do it. And I said, I think you ought to get Michael Burns. That was last year. And Michael said he couldn't go then. So, I forgot about it. But then they contacted me again and said, well, everybody's doing Zoom now. You can Zoom, right? So how about teaching Revelation over the weekend? And so I did 3 sessions on Revelation. Hopefully they'll get Michael over later when the travel kicks back in. I'd love for them to meet Michael and to learn from him. But I've had things come along that wouldn't have come along in an ordinary year, most likely, like that one. So I've done some scattered things that I wouldn't have thought I would be doing, teaching in the Zoom world. This next year, I don't have a lot of plans. I'm sort of like Michael. I was intending to write a couple of short books, which I did, but I don't have any other books in the lineup that I have in mind. And so I want to read more. I've joked in the past when I was doing a lot of writing and people are asking, what are you reading? I said, well, actually, I've written more books this year than I've read, which wasn't true, but it was a good hyperbole to say that I was spending a lot of time writing. But I want to spend more time reading and learning. I always read Michael's stuff because it's so good, but I want to spend more time reading and learning from others and let God be my divine scheduler. If he wants me to do something, I'll do it. But otherwise, I'll just be trying to live a day at a time in those day-tight compartments and let God be in control of the schedule.
Well, again, thank you so much just for being on the program. I feel very fortunate to have both of you just taking time out of your day. I do think that it definitely is an important mix to have both yourself, Gordon, and Michael Burns. I love just your relationship at the same time, just how you kind of bounce things off each other and just how you're, you just kind of finish each other's thoughts in a sense. And so I definitely appreciate seeing that relationship and really sharing that with others. So we're going to go ahead and wrap it up right here. I do want to recommend, if you can hold up the book one more time, Mr. Gordon. Now, is that the bridge that you share about in the book too, or no, is that a different bridge?
No, we just had a hard time figuring out a cover, and that's the one that the publisher ended up with. Okay.
But I just want to recommend that book for really everybody, right? Jew and Gentile, as they say, right?
Right.
It's really for everybody. So again, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. If you enjoyed the program, please click like and definitely subscribe for more videos to come. Thank you so much.